So a video from several years ago called Neo-Feminism Isn't Progressive, It's Conservative, from a young Kyle Kulinski.
Laura Bogart wrote a piece for Salon titled, "I'm Trying Not to Hate Men." Now, to me, this article is a good representation of what I just decided to dub neo-feminism.
It's not new, though. It's Valerie Solanas or Robin Morgan or Susan B. Anthony at Seneca Falls talking about how the ancient matriarchate was destroyed by the evil patriarchal invaders. You can call it neo-feminism, but it's really just feminism.
It's not, in my opinion, in line with what I would call traditional feminism, which is intelligent and which I actually agree with, which is the idea that
it's ignorant, and it has to be. How could you consider yourself to be a feminist without being ignorant of everything that feminism is and everything it means?
You know, when women were fighting for the right to vote, fighting for the right to work and be treated in an equal way.
Treated in an equal way, maybe, but the other two, not really. Women always had the right to work. In fact, they normally had the obligation to work, just like men did. And that changed only after the Industrial Revolution, when wealth became common enough that some people didn't have to work, and that was a benefit which accrued almost entirely to women. As for the right to vote, well, people had to fight for the right to vote. Not just women, but also, in fact more so, men. And feminists would say this is a class thing because it was working class men, but the reality is it was 95+% of men. At the time of the Great Reform riots in the 1830s, it was 2% of men in Britain who could vote, and the Great Reform Act got that all the way up to 3%. And that was a big enough change to require riots, to require cavalry charges into innocent protesting civilians, and many people died, many buildings were burned down during those protests. By comparison, the struggle to get women the vote was pretty simple, really.
That made sense, and that makes sense today, but this new branch of feminism, this neo-feminism, I think goes a little bit too far.
It's the silly too far argument again, you know? It's not too far, it's the wrong direction. If they were going too far in favour of equality, this wouldn't be a problem. Someone writing an article about how they're somewhat trying not to hate men, that's not someone who is too in favour of equality. That's someone who is too against men. So not too far, just the wrong direction.
She says, quote, "When I finally told my mother that the neighbor boy she'd been babysitting," which meant leaving the two of us alone together while she watched her soap operas upstairs.
Yeah, it's a pretty standard feminist origin story. She had a bad experience with, well, not even a man in this case, with a small boy, and that was enough to turn her into a man-hater. Frankly, the problem's with her there. Of course, she was a victim, it's very sad, but that doesn't mean that you can make judgments and generalizations about other groups. If you say you got mugged by a black guy and that's why you became a racist, then people are not going to take that seriously, and they shouldn't take this seriously either.
Before I could ever know anything different, this was maleness. Aggression and protection, equally awful. Something cowardly and brute. Something that hit you with its belt and pulled you beneath your favorite Lion King blanket and stuck its fingers in your vagina.
Yeah, that sort of thing is exactly what you can't justify by just having a bad experience. Like, yeah, she had a bad experience with a man or two. That doesn't mean that she should judge everyone based on that. It comes across as her just being bigoted and using her own negative experiences as an excuse to justify why she's so hate-filled.
Abused her, and then she was sexually abused when she was young, so she had all these horrific experiences that happened to her. And in no way do I discount anything from that. I mean, that's serious, and that should be addressed, and that those are problems. And
can we stop making special allowances for women? There are plenty of men out there who were victimised by women as children. In fact, most men who go to prison for rape were sexually abused by women when they were children, but we don't make special allowances for them on that basis. So I don't want to make special allowances for this bigoted woman either.
This is my problem with neo-feminism, is that it's actually very conservative in its nature. So what do I mean by that? I mean, you have a person that's willing to take personal experiences and then extrapolate to everybody else. Now, look, it's not me doing that, and it's not me extrapolating here. Again, I told you the title of the article. I'm trying not to hate men.
You see, I agree that conservatism and feminism are basically the same thing. Feminism is a very tradcon ideology. It's all about protecting the traditional privileges that women have in things like custody and child support, promoting a chivalry-based attitude towards violence that gives special protection to women, all that sort of traditionalist stuff. But I don't really think that judging groups based on individuals is a particularly conservative thing. So I agree with the title of the video, that neo-feminism isn't progressive, it's conservative, but everything else he's saying here is a little bit silly.
Now imagine if this was an article, just get rid of the word man and put in the word blacks, put in the word Jews, put in the word gays, put in any other word you want, Muslims. And Salon would never run a piece that said, I'm trying not to hate blacks, I'm trying not to hate gays, I'm trying not to hate Muslims, I'm trying not to hate Jews. And then in the article, the person starts out and spends the first 3 paragraphs explaining how, hey, when I was a kid, man, I was mugged by a black guy.
You see, he's completely right here, finally. But also, he wouldn't have spent so much time talking about how sad it was and how tragic that the white person had been mugged by a black guy or whatever. Instead, he would have just immediately denounced it, so he's not being entirely consistent here himself.
Now, look, understand something, man. I get hate from every angle on whenever I talk about these issues. Because I've said openly, and I'll say it again because I don't like them. I don't like the men's rights movement.
Is there really a meaningful difference between what he calls neo-feminists and just not wanting to do anything to help with men's issues? If you're going to denounce the men's rights movement and any sort of activism on any men's issue, then why pretend to be any different? Why not just say, why bother pretending that you don't want to hate men? Just do it.
I think, honestly, on most issues, they're whiny little punks, and they're clueless, and they just have this victim complex, and they're wrong, right? I mean, they have a point on, like, divorce issues.
Already way more vitriol towards the men's rights movement than in all the time that he was talking about this article, about how she's trying not to hate men. Someone who is explicitly an anti-male bigot, and he's just justifying it. But the men's rights movement, that's a step too far for Kyle Kulinski.
And stuff like that, alimony issues. So I'm with them on some issues, but on most issues I think they're silly. So I'm not in any camp on this. I'm just trying to be as objective as I possibly can.
So literally not a single example of an issue where he thinks men's rights the movement is silly. Just he's alright with alimony and divorce and custody and whatever, but other issues that he doesn't want to name are silly. I don't know what they are. Does he think like educational inequality or sentencing disparity or whatever? Are those just silly to him? Maybe. Or maybe he just is very ignorant about the whole thing and doesn't want to be associated with something more controversial than his own brand of feminism.
And when I look at stuff like this, I think you're not being progressive. You think you're being progressive, you think you're being high-minded, you think you're being intellectual, but you're just doing this broad-based smear of an entire group because you had some personal bad experiences at one point or another in your life.
But Kyle Kulinski is doing the same thing. That's his denouncement of the men's rights movement, and he hasn't even had those negative experiences. He's just decided to attack the men's rights movement because it's trendy with his friend group and with the people in his whatever part of the left he thinks he's in. But that's really no more progressive than the person he's attacking.
Again, I'm one of those people, truth is always a defense, right? And in her article, she goes on to make some good points where she says, well, like, look at the wars throughout history. Done by men. Now, again, a lot of people on the other side hate it when I agree with that point, but it's true! Like, I've had some people say, yeah, but you don't know about the thing where the women made the men go to war and then they did it.
I was thinking more of Margaret Thatcher or Indira Gandhi or Golda Meir. Female leaders have a much higher rate of starting wars than male leaders do. And, assuming he's not victim-blaming conscripts, then we're also just talking about a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of men who have ever had the opportunity to start a war.
So, wait. Well, assuming that's true, which I don't believe it, but assuming that's true, then you're telling me what? Men don't have a mind of their own and they can't say no, they can't think for themselves? So women are just more cunning than men and more clever than men to get them to go to war for them when the men didn't actually want to go. So either men are stupid or men are warmongers.
Again, he's literally just doing exactly the same thing that he's criticising the writer of this article for. Take a tiny number of men and then just say, this man warmonger, so therefore men are warmongers. And of course he's excusing everything that women do. Like, yeah, it's not the case that women, with the exception of certain politicians, have forced men to go to war, but you look at something like the white feather movement, and you've got to realise that choices have consequences, and yeah, it's possible to pressure people into doing things, even when they technically have the choice not to. Although I doubt he's talking about the white feather movement. I've got no idea what he's actually talking about there.
That's not a defense, right? Yes, it's true. Most of the violence done in the world is from men. Most of the wars have been from men. There are definite issues and definite gender problems. There's still not total pay equality. There's still inherent biases in the way we look at women compared to men. When we say, a woman who sleeps with a lot of guys is a slut, is a whore. A man who sleeps with a lot of women is a stud.
All of these things are issues that have exact mirrors. Like, yeah, okay, women maybe are more likely to be judged for being slutty, but then again, men are more likely to be judged for being sexually unsuccessful. It's just exactly the same issue, but on the other side. But he just doesn't seem to take that seriously. Doesn't even seem to realise that it exists. And pay equality? Well, there is pay equality. In fact, women amongst young people make more money than men do, and men only make more in couples that are married and have children, because they sacrifice the opportunity to stay with their children to make money so that the woman can stay with the children instead. That's not even just the other side of the issue, that is the issue. The issue is that women have the opportunity not to work, working as a left-winger. The bourgeoisie are the people who don't work but benefit from the labour of others. That's basically the position of women in this situation. But again, Kyle Kulinski can't allow himself to realise this. And violence isn't committed by men as a gestalt, right? It's committed by something like 1% of men commit over 85% of the violent crimes that men commit. And those are the 1% that have been victims mostly of child abuse, which is disproportionately committed by women. But all Kyle Kulinski can see is, hey, here's an excuse to shit on men. So again, I really don't even know what his problem with this article, or what he calls neo-feminism, is, because he's doing exactly the same thing.
Yes, there are real issues, but when you smear like this, and you take this position, you're not making any friends, and you're not being factual, and you're not being accurate, and you're not being progressive, and you're making more enemies than you are making allies. And you should understand that to flip the repression is never the right approach,
Again, all of this is exactly what Kyle Kulinski himself is doing throughout this entire video. So Kyle Kulinski seems pretty bad. Maybe not as bad as Big Joel or Xanderhall, but still pretty bad. It's easy to agree with when he's attacking what he calls neo-feminism, but then he doesn't seem to realise that he completely agrees with them on every single issue. At some point I'll look at something he's done more recently than 8 years ago. Maybe he's come to his senses since then. Maybe he's had a bit of time for self-reflection and realised that he was just as bad. But until then, that's enough Kyle Kulinski.